Hi, my name is 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗸𝗁𝗁, Microsoft MVP, and I can't wait to share with all of you how to take Microsoft 365 migration and governance and move faster, manage better. These are tips you can't miss. So with that, let's dive into some of the most important insights. The first thing is that we all feel the shared pain and challenges of today. We're seeing the increasing expectations, almost an exponential increase in these expectations from customers, partners, and more, often driven by AI. At the same time, we're overwhelmed, not just overwhelmed by the rate of the change, but ourselves struggling to prioritize and invest in the right things from an IT perspective. And this is why it's helpful to understand what are those top priorities for other IT organizations. Well, it turns out that many are looking to bridge this gap between where we are today and where we need to be, using migration and governance as the tip of their spear. The reason for this makes a lot of sense when we start to dive into the data. You see, in the world of consolidation, we actually get a lot of value in having the data connected or in Microsoft 365. In the Copilot era or the AI era overall, having the data accessible to the AI means that we can innovate faster. Not only that, but getting rid of legacy or other alternatives also simplifies reducing shadow AI risk and significantly increasing the security posture and compliance posture. And that's why we're seeing a huge increase in the number of customers migrating from legacy to leading edge. So think of the number of users that are migrating from, say, SharePoint Server or file shares to Microsoft 365. You'd expect that to decrease over time because there's less and less of these on-prem environments. However, we actually see an increase, and this increase overwhelmingly is being driven by AI consolidation desire. This isn't just true for on-prem to the cloud. We also see this happening with tenant-to-tenant consolidation. And in fact, again, mergers and acquisitions are not just on the rise, but the effect of a merger and acquisition is more complex when it comes to migrations because we have more workloads. We're now even migrating agents, and we're thinking more and more about the data that those agents might consume and how that needs to be migrated in that merger. Not only is that a concern, but we also see a growing demand of moving away from things like Google towards Microsoft 365 as people work through what is their core AI strategy that's more governed, more managed, and of course, innovating faster, which may be Microsoft 365 and Microsoft 365 Copilot. Well, that's what the data is telling us. But let's dive a little bit deeper. One of the things that's driving a lot of this is the demand for better governance experiences. But if you take something as simple as data security posture management today with AI, we know that if the data is not in Microsoft 365, if it's not indexed, detected, and assessed, then it can't be determined whether it's sensitive or not sensitive before it moves into these other shadow AI or maybe unsanctioned or less preferred AI solution sets. And it also allows us to actually have better visibility and observability of when this is occurring. But that's not the only way to look at this. The other big elephant in the room is when we think of legacy, we have to think about what are the workloads. And overwhelmingly, we see a large number of users of organizations are still using SharePoint 2016 and 2019. 66% of organizations still have production instances of 2016 and 2019, and that is hitting end of extended support very soon. And so why is that? And why are so many of those same organizations not planned their migration yet? They have no firm plan and they haven't done it. Well, it turns out a lot of the challenge with migrations, not just these ones, but like migrations in general, is actually the assessment work. Now, I want to emphasize that just like we have AI as a carrot to drive consolidation, we also have end of support as the stick, because there is a huge risk if these environments are left as they are after the extended end of support and they don't get security patching anymore. This creates a very significant risk, meaning you need to be off of these environments by, in this case, July 2026, because if we're not, we are going to most likely have compromise and attacks. If you're looking for guidance on this, there are some resources from the community and more that break down a lot of the considerations like how to prepare, how to do your assessment, how to work through the planning process and more. And this is where I want to spend a little bit of time together here, not specifically about SharePoint, although we will use that as our core example, but because assessments in general can make a lot of migrations go faster. Well, the first thing we might want to look at is something like, what are the Microsoft tools that are available to us to support the assessment? In the example of SharePoint Server 2016, we can use something called SMAT that actually extracts a number of CSV reports based on what's detected in the environment, signaling a number of different risks. Now, there's a few problems. Number one is, while this tool is something I do encourage you to use for SharePoint 2016, it doesn't work for SharePoint 2019 or SharePoint Server Subscription Edition. So we have very inconsistent assessment tooling from Microsoft as a first party. Not only that, but it has a lot of false positives. You have to be able to quickly filter down these lists to figure out what's real and what's not, and how might it impact your estimates. Conversely, you might use a third-party tool. They help you quickly assess, say, the SharePoint environment, understanding the risks like, hey, these are unsupported templates, here's where they are, here's what they mean. You can kind of hover over each of these and find out more. These types of things can make a world of difference. But again, I don't want to just emphasize SharePoint. There are other types of assessments that are relevant here. So let's talk through another kind of assessment. Let's say you're doing a tenant-to-tenant assessment. Well, in a tenant-to-tenant assessment, what you might be looking for is very quickly at a glance, all of the key signals. You're not just often looking at a tenant-to-tenant at one workload. You're looking at OneDrive, you're looking at SharePoint, you're looking at Teams, you're looking at different workloads. And as we look at those different workloads, we then can see, not just at a glance, insights around the storage, the sizings, things like that, that definitely help us with preliminary estimates, but we also get a sense of what are those risks. As an example, we can see there are quite a few sites and teams that are inactive. If we dive a bit deeper, we can actually get the reports on those things, enabling us to provide that information to key business users and stakeholders so they can actually start with a pre-migration planning as we continue our assessment, maybe reducing the amount of content because some of these could be archived or they could be excluded from scope. What about things like very large sites or collections that might be problematic due to throttling or other issues? These are all things that we can detect early and often. Now, these are just a few examples of how you can do assessments, but the key here is that assessments themselves are critical. Leading with them makes a big difference. And we see this overwhelmingly in the data. When we ask those 650 Microsoft 365 IT pros and admins, hey, how are you working through the challenges of migrations? Overwhelmingly, 87% leverage partners when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. That's partners for the planning, the migration, and of course, even post-migration, which is getting into the governance space. In each of these scenarios, the ones that used partners had a much higher satisfaction and ran into less issues overall in the migration. And when you have a major consolidation event, and we know that these are going to be more common, especially the importance of these with the AI era, it becomes really important for us to have a repeatable and consistent playbook. So I would encourage you to work with partners as well. So what's the next big challenge? Well, the next big challenge with migrations and consolidation is actually security and compliance, which gets us closer to governance. You see, security and compliance is something you can actually do during the migration. You can improve your posture and you can improve security and compliance. How do we potentially do that? Well, one way to do that is to look at the structure of what we're migrating and see if there's some structural improvements we can make. Think of SharePoint Server and going from SharePoint Server into SharePoint Online. In scenarios like that, you're going to do a lot of work where you're going to actually remodel permissions, sort of garbage in, garbage out. We do this with file shares as well. In both instances, being able to quickly remap permissions using the migration tooling can make a big difference. So I highly encourage, whether it's doing assessment work to understand the permissions and doing some Excel work to map that all out and get some business involvement. Yes, we can simplify here. Yeah, we don't need this permissioning anymore. Find all those orphaned users. I really think this orphaned one's a big one, right? Find all those users that no longer have access, like they don't exist in AD anymore or Entra, and we just don't need them anymore. So let's just remove those people, and that's way less clutter when we do our migration. There's so many things we can do programmatically and structurally. And once you've done those structure and programmatic things, consider how you might use them after the migration. So let's say you've done all that to consolidate and simplify when you're migrating. Well, after you migrate, and we've all been through many restructuring events, we all know that the structure is not static in organizations, and that means a lot of movement. If you've ever tried to use out-of-the-box tools to do a lot of movement, copying of content and things like that, while it may work for little scenarios, it doesn't really scale. And that's where a third-party tool, maybe the same one you're using for migrations like ShareGate, can make a world of difference on restructuring. In fact, a great example of a restructuring event that you do in the migration, but you might also do after a migration, is something like flattening subsites. So in traditional terms, in SharePoint, we used to have things called subsites. And in the new modern experiences, we want to hub before we sub. We want to flatten those. And so to do this manually requires a lot of work, maybe some scripting where we provision the new sites and experiences, then we migrate each of the collections, the libraries, the configurations, all of that across. Well, again, a tool like ShareGate can save a lot of time and do this reliably. So this is a great use case for using a tool to improve our information architecture and by proxy, improve our security posture, which improves Copilot experiences. When we talk about migrations, it's really easy to underestimate the importance of differentiating an optimization versus a migration. The number one reason many migration projects take longer is because people are trying to optimize during the migration. Now, we did highlight there are things you can structurally do that can improve it. Those are programmatic, those are predictable, but a lot of what we might want to do are things that really fit in the continuous improvement bucket and that are really business owned versus technology team owned. And these optimization activities need to be isolated. If you can do this, you'll find your migration projects are far faster and far more successful. And in fact, your optimization work will be much better because that will have its own focus and emphasis, having things like iterative sprints, using specialized tools. Again, optimize in the destination, don't optimize in the source. Do that work in that phase and often treat it as a post-migration activity because it will continue to be a high demand. In fact, a lot of optimization actually directly correlates to governance because a lot of optimization is about improving our posture, our life cycle, the understanding of our spaces, and all of those things means that governance is actually much easier. So let's talk about governance. You see, while you can use tools to do the migration and accelerate it like ShareGate, you can also use those types of tools to help with the governance experience. This is important because overwhelmingly in the data, we know that people struggle with a few things when it comes to Microsoft 365 management. They struggle with ensuring proper security and controls, governance policies, and especially data sprawl and lack of organization. All of these things are directly addressed within a migration. Think about it. You do all this work to understand the sites, the spaces, who the business owners are, which departments they relate to. You get all this wonderful, rich data. Then you migrate it, and then you just leave that data behind. If you use that data to power your governance planning, that makes a world of difference. So migrations and consolidation events are actually one of the best opportunities to really accelerate your governance story. So how could we potentially do that? Well, the first thing to talk about is how today AI works when it comes to governance. Historically, you could just have service-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. You could basically plan the configuration, how you manage your SharePoint and OneDrive services, how you manage Teams as a service, and you'd be in a good place. However, in the last few years, it's been more and more important to also manage your containers, especially post-pandemic. What are all of those teams? What are all of those SharePoint sites? Do we know what they are? Do we know who owns them? Do we have owners for them? Do we understand whether they're active or inactive? Should they be archived? Should they be kept current? Do we understand if they're overshared or not overshared? These are all things we often do at the container level. And this is, again, where most organizations are today. However, in the AI era, when we use Copilot at scale, it's critical that we're actually dealing with the third level down. We're dealing with document-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. In that area, that's when we can really drive greater success. And to get there, there's of course different ways to do it. This simple 10-step plan may look simple, but actually step 5 is one of the hardest parts. We want intelligent default labels, meaning that if I know a site is a project site, and its department equals HR, maybe that suggests that it should have a default label of X on all of the content within it. That would allow for better protection and be great for Copilot. So Copilot will automatically inherit that label and treat it as appropriately. However, if we don't understand those spaces, we run into this challenge of being able to apply the default label. So again, the container actually drives a lot of the document level or row level data protection scenarios we want to do. So how do we address this? Well, one way to address this is to take a step back and say, how do we do our assessments? Remember earlier, we mentioned the importance of assessments for migration, but they're actually really useful even for governance. So let's use one way of doing this. This is, I'm not going to say the wrong way, but this is the way that some people are doing it today because they just don't have the investment, proactive investment in governance. So what you could do is you could take something like portfolio management, a growing demand for agents. And you could say, hey, under data security posture management for AI in Purview, let's go to the Contoso invoice agent. In the Contoso invoice agent, we can see which data sources it's leveraging. Oh, it's leveraging these data sources. These data sources are labeled and not labeled. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to apply a label to the content that's unlabeled, and we're going to do it in this way, and so on and so forth. So you can actually use almost the opposite. You take the agent experience and then work your way through what is all the data that it's retrieving, and then you can optimize that data for labeling. This can work, but it's really problematic because it means you're late to the party. It means that you're exposed before you do this. And that's why proactive governance at the container or the service level is so critical, because the more you do it at that level, the more you're pre-preparing, and there's less and less of these little exceptions. So this should be used as an exception-based tactic to improve the security and posture. But even then, keep in mind, this is a Purview-centric scenario. In Purview, it's all about labels. That's the solution to all problems. But actually, we have unused files. What about archiving? What about things like ownership? Who are the owners of these things? Do we know who the owner is? Owners of sites, of containers, or of content itself. These are all things that you can actually get on the SharePoint side, or in the team side, but both require, again, different levels of skills and focus. They're not in Purview today. So now we're going to get into other admin centers and experiences. And this is why in the data, the same people that are struggling the most with ensuring proper security, access controls, governance policies, and data sprawl are actually the same ones who are using built-in Microsoft tools and nothing else. Again, while it's really important to maximize Microsoft tools, we have to acknowledge that they are necessary but not sufficient. We need to use a mixture of scripting, manual processes, and of course, third-party tools if we really want to be proactive and successful in the AI era when it comes to governance. And that's exactly why so many people are turning to tools like ShareGate Protect. What it does is it gives us a way of quickly assessing and understanding those risks. Here we can see at a glance key insights across the tenant. What I want to do then is I want to dig into what really matters. So here's some recommended insights for this tenant. As we can see, we have a number of workspaces that are inactive. Let's zero in on that particular one. When we zero in on that particular signal, we can see a combination of both teams and SharePoint collections that are at risk for inactivity, and maybe that are good opportunities for us to do some sort of review process or something more. If we were to look at that in SharePoint, there are ways of doing this. In the SharePoint Admin Center, you can go to least active sites, and then you can kind of sort this list. But that's different than going to Teams, going to usage reporting, switching it to Teams usage or the last 180 days, showing the last activity date, which is a far right column here, and then being able to export this and then correlate it, and so on and so forth. So you can do this with scripts, you can do this with the UI, but it takes a lot of steps and a lot of work just to get a point in time insight into, say, something like inactivity. Why are third-party tools useful? Because they can save a lot of clicks and a lot of time. And the more accessible this makes it, the more likely it is that you'll be proactive with your governance. Similarly, let's take another great example. Let's talk about oversharing, right? A very common challenge. In oversharing, maybe what we look for are the private, so these are private Microsoft Teams that also have the everyone except external users, that's the EEU, permission set. What does that mean? It means in SharePoint, they have everyone by external users. So that means like everyone has access to it, but it's a private team. That's a signal that might need or warrant some sort of access review. So again, being able to quickly get the insight that you need can make a world of difference. Let's summarize all of this. What we're saying is that migration and governance can and does bridge this gap faster. Not only does it bridge it faster, but it's us working together that really makes this successful. Find ways to simplify and streamline and automate, and you will find yourself moving faster and quicker towards proactive and successful governance in the AI era. And that only works when we consolidate as much as we can into Microsoft 365. If this was helpful to you, I highly encourage you to take a look at a few things. One, go grab a free trial of ShareGate so you can assess your own environment and accelerate your migrations. Request a demo if you want to see more about your specific workload and how it might work. And of course, get early access to the ShareGate Protect experience, something that's going to save you a lot of time when it comes to governance. If you found some of the data and charts useful in this presentation, I highly encourage you to go grab those at the free report online. And don't forget, Microsoft 365, we've got this.